Hello and welcome to another reading from Michael D. Nato. This one, let me tell you a little bit about this one. This is a story of Seltemver, an elven pirate that I created through an oops through a text with one of my editors. BK Bass had meant to say September, but somehow it auto-corrected into this really cool looking elven name. So long story short, when time came to write a short story, I decided to go for it and have fun. And it has blossomed into something that I did not expect. I mean, I've had nine short stories now, all connected through this cursed elf with an imp and a ship full of orcs. It's good fun. The one I'm going to read for you today was the short story that started it all, called Across the Wide Seas. Chapter 1, Arrival in a Strange Land. He shook his head as he walked into the tavern, his short white hair spraying seawater over the patrons nearest him. He whipped off his worn, brown long coat and spun a chair around to sit, slinging his longbow on his back. His old friend Aminar fluttered up as he took off his coat, then settled back down on his shoulder with a huff that was ignored with practiced ease. That was the worst sailing he had been through in a while, and they were lucky to be alive, though where in the heavens he was this time was anyone's guess. The elf laid his sheathed sword in his lap because the patrons were looking a little gruff about him being here. He would hate to kill someone on his first day in this town. Hey, elf, where'd you come from anyway? Ain't never seen anything like that there. The big man pointed to the creature on the elf's shoulder. You've never seen a longbow? The elf asked sarcastically, knowing full well that the man was talking about Aminar, the tiny winged imp on his shoulder. Seltemver, he thinks I'm a thing, Aminar said, looking around the place for another exit just in case it came to blows. The poor thing hated violence. To him, you are a thing. Hey, Aminar said with mock indignation. I'm just saying. Seltemver looked at the man and smiled, which never helped, or so he was told. My friend here is harmless, and no, I'm not from around here. The elf kicked the chair opposite him and gestured for the man to sit. The big man grunted. The rest of the patrons waited silently as the man sat hesitantly, the mumblings going back to normal once he had. My name is Seltemver Ashblade, and this is my friend, Aminar. Aminar, say hello. Hello, Aminar said, imitating a parrot. Anyway, Seltemver said, smacking his friend lightly to make him behave. Would you tell us where we are, good sir? The man scratched his head and looked at the ceiling for a minute. What did I do to deserve this? He asked under his breath, then fixed his gaze on Seltemver once more. You don't know where you are? How did you get here if you didn't know where you were going? You always find the smart ones, don't you? Aminar asked as the imp started a passing serving girl with his tiny black eyes. Hush, Aminar. Seltemver sighed and waved his hand for the girl to come over as she walked by. You see, good man, we were on my ship, the Sea Haven, sailing out of Larishan Cove, when we hit a terrible storm. We fought our way through it with some casualties and limped into port here, wherever here happens to be. It helped that most of that was the truth. All right, 60% truth at least. Oh, well, then you happen to be at the port town of Nasher, the man said. He leaned back as the serving girl came over and put down 4 copper pieces. Ale, Filden. Yes, sir. And you, good sir? Filden asked, averting her eyes from the table. I'll have whatever is standard, house ale or mead, Seltemver said, eyeing the rest of the bar with suspicion. It had gone quiet once more, and he didn't know why. What was he missing? Chapter 2. Strange place indeed. Mead? The serving girl asked with a confused tone. Where have you brought me? Aminar asked, feigning a grievous wound and teetering on the elf's shoulder as if he was about to plummet to his death. She's not heard of mead. All right, that's enough. Seltemver growled and felt the imp stiffen on his shoulder. He looked at the big man across from him with more attention this time, knowing he must have missed something. He had plain breeches and a tunic, nothing special there. His hair was short and well kept, his muscles were honed from regular use, and his skin bore a dark tan. Probably a farmer or some such, the elf thought. The big man's eyes didn't show any spark of great intellect, but Seltemver had gathered that from the conversation already. In fact, the man was the perfect example of normal. Too normal. It had to be an act. I never got your name, sir, Seltemver asked nonchalantly. That you didn't, stranger. The man pushed his chair back and stood slowly, flexing his arms and cracking his back and neck. He held out his hand towards the serving girl. Filden, ale, now. The girl grabbed an ale from the next table to them without asking and handed it to the man, and he drained it in one shot. Seltemver hooked his foot around the bottom of his chair as he sat back, ready for trouble, but trying to look comfortable. More patrons got up, but this time came over to the big man's side. Well, there goes the no killing on the first day thing, he thought sardonically. Then it clicked. Nasher, I presume. The man called Nasher smiled and took a large club from one of the men nearest him, testing it for balance and weight. You see, stranger, this is my town, and newcomers with strange pets spell trouble, especially your kind. Seltemver, he called me a pet, Eminar said, looking to the rafters, probably for a safe place to fly to. Not only did the imp abhor violence, blood made him squeamish. If it came to blows, and honestly, when it did it not lately, the imp would bolt from the highest beam and wait it out like he always did. Not now, Eminar, Seltemver said, sizing up the other men that had joined Nasher's side. They didn't seem overly competent, mainly the type that use overwhelming numbers and intimidation to cower their opponents. They would die quickly. So you want me to leave? Fine, I'll be going, Seltemver said, knowing they wouldn't let him leave. He could see that they already had weapons drawn and fire in their veins, but it did give them pause. They are so used to immediate violence that I confused them, he thought as the men started to look to each other. Where the hell did I end up? Too late for that, Elf. Your kind always spells trouble, Nasher said as he advanced upon Seltemver. I just wanted to see if you were here for Lord Massenel or not. Since you're not here for him, I can just kill you and be done with it. He raised his club and started to bring it down, but Seltemver burst into action. Seltemver stood, flexed his leg, and sent his chair flying into the man to his right. He drew his blade and slashed at Nasher in one fluid movement, the magically sharp blade opening the man's belly, as he grabbed another chair and threw it at a third man. The elven warrior backed up, avoiding the splash of blood and entrails as Nasher dropped his club and grasped at his innards, spilling from the wound. What? Nasher started to say as his gut slipped through his fingers and splashed to the ground around his blood-soaked boots. The man dropped to his knees, swayed for a moment as his eyes glossed over, then fell to the ground dead. Seltemver spun and danced with his sharp, thin blade, parrying blows with ease. No words were spoken as they danced around the table. Fear slowly crept into the faces of his opponents as one after another fell to his enchanted blade. Aminar had flown straight up, probably hiding until it was over. He would never get used to an imp that hated violence. Imps, by their very nature, were violent and malicious, yet this one had always been a bit of a coward. A club struck his shoulder, but he spun with the impact and came around with his sword to take the man in the leg. He finished the man quickly, and a second man after that. It lasted less than a minute. The attackers were all down, and the rest of the patrons had fled out the back door. All but the serving girl. Filden, I think her name was, he thought as he wiped his blade on one of the dead men. Chapter 3. Tough Choices. Filden stood right where she was, daring not to move lest the elves see that as a sign of aggression. He had been talking so nicely, and then suddenly he had turned into this killer. Worse, he was good at it. Very good. Lord Massenel would come down on the town with a vengeance now. Nasher was his pet enforcer. She saw the elf looking at her and swallowed hard. You're not going to kill me too, are you? Why would I kill you? Seltemver met her eyes as he sheathed his sword. Filden leaned back against the bar. I don't know, just you killed all of them, and so quickly. She had to sit down then, the scene getting to her finally. Yet she was awkwardly happy. Nasher was an absolute brute, and she would never have to suffer his meaty touch again. Now they just had to survive the Lord's wrath. Well, I have this thing about people attacking me, Seltemver said as he spied his friend in the rafters and signals for him to come down. I tend to retaliate with extreme force. It works very well, as no one that attacks me ever does it a second time. He moved to her side with caution and laid a hand on her shoulder. She smiled up at him as he comforted her. It was an odd being cared for by a complete stranger. Well, then you have to get out of here, Filden said as she sat there trying to process all that she had seen. It's not like she had never seen a dead body or anything, yet this was somehow different. Lord Massenel will know about this soon and probably send down a force to deal with you. Great, more violence. Why do I stay with you, Seltemver? Aminar said as he alighted upon his friend's shoulder once more. You stay because you are bound to my soul. Yeah, there is that. Filden shook her head and got up to get her meager belongings. She didn't have a room, per se, as she slept on the floor in the back room, but she did keep a bag behind the bar with what she held most dear. She knew that if she could get away from this damn town, she could truly start a life and be free of slavery once and for all. Now she just had to survive. Let's hope this elf is as good as he seems. Chapter 4, Fight or Flight. Seltemver waited as Philden stood and walked to the bar to grab her bag, talking as she went. Does he protect you? She asked, taking off her apron and letting down her hair. Her demeanor had changed, and Seltemver thought she seemed relieved to be free of this place. He is supposed to, but he doesn't like violence, Seltemver said, looking at his friend and smiling despite the remark. He grabbed his coat and shook it out, spun it around his shoulder, and settled it over his bow once more. Aminar leapt up and came back down as the coat gown on, clearing his throat loudly and puffing out his little chest, trying to look dignified. I am bound to keep him alive at all costs. If he dies, I would be thrust down into the pits of the hells forever, burning endlessly in torment until time ends. Drama hound, psychopath. So, Philden interjected before they really got into it. Do you have a ship we could take before the Lord comes? Seltemver smiled. He had guessed right. She didn't say take me home or let me leave before you. She'd asked to go with him. He looked at her and noticed for the first time how stunning she was. She had long blonde hair and a slim build with piercing green eyes. Pity that he wasn't thinking of leaving just yet. No, the ship was heavily damaged and needs time to make repairs. Seltemver noticed her frown and couldn't help but laugh. Don't worry, I know how to handle a lord. This one is not a noble by any means. He is a warlord. Philden sighed and hefted her bag over her shoulder. Well, I'm going with you no matter where it is. My life here is done after all this. She gestured to the carnage. You can't just work for the bar still? Eminar asked, seeming interested in her dilemma. It doesn't seem to be that big of a deal. Philden chuckled and patted Eminar on the head. You don't understand. Nasher was my owner, and a slave can't live when her owner has died and there was no transaction. I'm free property, and free property is always cashed out. Slavery, Seltemver said with disgust. He hated that trade, and it was the one thing he would never stoop to. Well, warlord or not, I'm still not worried about this Massenel. He walked to the door and opened it, stepping out into the overcast morning. The little town of Nasher, if that was what it was truly called, seemed nice at first glance. A wide, packed earthen road ran from the docks up through the center of town, sporting what businesses there were. Off of this, there were roads, presumably leading to houses, with women hanging clothes and doing other such chores, as the distant ring of the blacksmith, busy at work, echoed in the evening air. Ahead, in what could only be a merchant's area, boys cried out for deals on their prospective masters as dusk approached and the vendors started closing up their carts. Seltemver smiled. It looked quaint, actually, until he saw the row of horses with armed men riding towards him with a heavily armored man in their midst. They moved with purpose and were bearing down on the trio, staring with smiles that had no mirth in them. Lord Massenel and his men, no doubt. Speak of the demon, Eminar said, looking around for another place to hide. Seltemver, are you sure we can't run for the ship anyway? Philden asked nervously. It's fine. I'll take care of this. Just stay behind me. Seltemver had faced odds like this before, but admittedly not while protecting someone as well. He drew his enchanted sling blade slowly to add effect for the men watching. The blade was always sharp and would cut through most things with ease. As the approaching men slowed down, he spread his feet apart and made notes on which one looked brave and which one seemed unsure. This was when reading people really came in handy. Chapter 5, Heavy Heart. Jason Drake rode point with his lord behind him. The stranger had reportedly killed Nasher. Gods above, take that man's soul anyway. And the lord meant to deal swift and harsh justice. At least what Lord Massenel considered justice, that is. He shifted in his scale armor and fingered his short sword in its worn leather sheath. Jason had been leading the men under Nasher, that enormous pile of filth of a man, for over 4 years now as captain of the watch, and he despised Lord Massenel just as much as his dead superior. His family, however, depended on his income. So here he was, killing another person for no good reason other than probably defending himself. Eyes front, Captain Drake. This man is dangerous and must be taken seriously. The tone of his lord told him that that pompous bastard wasn't taking any chances. Admittedly, when he had heard it was an elf, he had worried as well. Lord Massenel summoned all of his guard under the captain of the watch and rode out immediately. 20 trained cavalry would have no trouble against a lone swordsman, even if it was an elf. Jason kicked his horse in front of the other men, signaling them to slow. He proceeded carefully, keeping an eye on the elf as he neared. The stranger had already shifted his feet, a sign that he was skilled. Assuming a stance to sidestep any charge that the horse would make, and opposite his shield arm at that, showed Jason that his foe was well trained and then some. Hail, elf. I, Jason Drake, captain of the watch, hereby place you under arrest for murder. He had barely finished the sentence when the elf ran towards him at full speed. He had missed the movement until the stranger was halfway to him, that slim blade gleaming despite the overcast weather. Jason whistled and pulled the reins of his horse, spinning the beast around in a blink to get his shield to bear and block any incoming blow. When the elf ducked under the shield and slashed low, Jason knew he was doomed. The elf was going for the saddle straps. Kill him and the woman, Lord Massenel yelled from behind him, inciting half of the men to charge while keeping some around him. Jason thrust his short sword to parry the slim blade as the elves slashed and their weapons rang out across the earthen road. To his shock, his short sword had been sliced in half. The horse reared as Jason pulled the reins again, spinning the horse away from that deceptively sharp blade. Yet the elf had rolled under the deadly hooves and slashed once more at the straps holding the saddle in place. Jason tried to leap clear, but his heavy armor prevented such agile movements. As the saddle came free, he tumbled from the beast and hit hard. Before he could roll away, the horse came down on his leg with its front hooves and crushed it. Jason cried out in shock and pain as the elf leapt upon the beast and took off towards the men charging at them. Chapter 6. Among the Enemy. Seltemver slashed, finally severing the strap to the saddle, and watched the captain fall to the dirt. He could tell the young man had no heart in this fight, and he wanted to spare as many that didn't rush to their deaths as he could. Sometimes, however, it couldn't be helped. He saw the horse crush the man's leg and winced, knowing that he was done in this fight. He leapt up onto the horse bareback and kicked it around to meet the charging cavalry, guiding the animal with his knees. Seltemver had been riding horses for over 100 years and felt right at home. The move surprised the men, as usually a lone rider tried to flee. Seltemver was among them then, taking 3 of them down right away in the confusion, his sword slicing through their leather and sending them to the dirt. Seltemver felt blades bite into his arm and back as he spun this way and that, slashing with methodical savagery. The wounds he took were minor, so he grimaced through the pain and killed 2 more that came at him. He spared a glance back at Philbin and Aminar, seeing the imp behind the girl and holding onto her leg. Don't worry, he does this all the time, the imp said. Seltemver could tell whose heart was in this fight and whose wasn't, so he turned the horse towards the main host, surrounding the lord, and kicked forward in another rush. He slashed left, taking another man out, but not before a man with a spear stabbed him squarely in the shoulder, the blow almost taking him right off the horse. Missed that guy. I must be getting old, he joked with himself. And I won't be getting any older if I miss that spear guy again. Seltemver swung his horse around and slashed the spearman across his back, cutting clean through the leather armor and into his spine. He spun the horse and kicked it towards the lord, parrying blows from the remaining 3 soldiers as he charged. Fight me so that these men will live, coward, Lord Massenel shouted back. You surprise me, elf. I had expected a summary execution, but instead you treat us to a display of expert swordsmanship. Challenging me might be the only mistake you made today. The lord guided his horse out from behind the 10 men around him, waving them back. I would have let you off with a quick death, but now you will learn what pain is. The lord charged then, the 2 warriors meeting as the overcast sky opened up and poured rain down among the town. Seltemver swung his sword and caught the lord in the chest as he passed, his sword ringing off the ornate armor like it was a mountain. The sword sounded almost like it was crying, denied the blood that it yearned for. The elven warrior came around and found that the lord was ready for him, slashing at the elf's horse. Seltemver knew the animal was doomed, so he pulled his feet up and pushed off, leaping for the side to get clear of the falling beast, lest he get caught under the rolling animal. He landed in a roll, his sword flying away to his right, and came up covered in dirt and blood. He knew he was in trouble. Seltemver saw Lord Massenel dismount slowly, giving him time to gain his feet. A sense of dread crawled down the elf's back. This man didn't care. He lunged for his sword, rolling again and coming up as the big man charged him, his own sword whistling through the air in a deadly arc. Seltemver blocked it and riposted, the blade again bouncing off the man's armor. Not good, he thought, backing up slowly. That never happens. Give up, elf. No weapon may pierce this enchanted armor, and many have tried. Even the joints are impervious to penetration. You have no chance. Massenel laughed as he advanced once more, his wicked sword swinging for Seltemver's head. It was a feint, though, and one he missed. Sadly, for as soon as Seltemver ducked, Massenel's other hand punched low, catching him hard in the sternum. The air rushed out of his lungs, and he was hefted up with that same hand, easily held aloft from the grip of the armored lord. Little help, Eminar? Chapter 7. To the rescue. Eminar was horrified. Never had he seen his friend and master thrown around like this. Then he heard the Lord say that the armor was enchanted, and he knew Seltemver was in trouble. He saw the big man heft his master up in the air like a child's doll and tried to stop his wings from shaking. The remaining guards had all stopped and were watching the exchange with eager eyes. At least some of them were. Some were looking at the ground, unwilling to witness what they knew would come next. Eminar didn't want to even guess what that was. If it could turn hardened warriors to look away, then it was bad. The imp was still trying to figure out if he needed to actually intervene when Seltemver actually asked for help, and Eminar sighed. The choice had been taken from him. It helped to know that he had to act or his friend would perish. He closed his eyes and concentrated, pulling his power up from deep within. He hated this part the most. When the power rose to the surface, he opened his eyes that now had a deep red glow to them. Eminar looked out from behind Filden and pointed straight at Lord Massenel. Akresh firin sistren duawin tahelen, he said, his voice resounding across the open road for all to hear with a deep resonating echo. The sound of the hellish power cowed men and beast alike, the remaining guards fleeing rather than face whatever could have uttered those words. When Eminar felt the power take hold of Massenel, he looked away. I'm sorry, Eminar whispered to himself, more than anyone still nearby. He held on to the girl with preternatural strength, lest she flee as well. She resisted only slightly, then relaxed and crumpled down in the dirt, sobbing in the rain. Seltemver smiled at the sound of Aminar's voice. He alone, out of anyone here, knew what was coming. Swords can't get to you, Massenel, he said with gasping breath. But how do you feel about fire? Aminar watched as the Lord's eyes widened in horror, dropping Seltemver and backing away. Massenel spun in circles, calling out for mercy as flames began to consume him from within. Fire gushed out of the gaps of the enchanted armor, even coming out of the neck, licking his flesh like a hungry lover. Lord Massenel screamed, thrashing on the ground now as he tried desperately to remove the armor that had only moments before protected him, but now entrapped him within the burning wrath of the deep hells. His screams echoed across the entire town as flames took his flesh first, then worked down to the bone, burning him to a cinder, the infernal power keeping him conscious past the point where he should have blacked out from the pain. Around the thrashing lord, flames spouted from the ground, forming hands that curled around him and pulled the burning body into the earth itself, the dirt closing in after, sealing him away. It was over in moments, yet Massenel's screams continued to echo as if from very far away, adding to the horror. Chapter 8. Decisions. As the rain poured down, finally quenching the remaining flames now that the infernal magic had dissipated, Seltemver looked at the only people left near them, Filden, who couldn't run because Eminar held her, Eminar, who was now looking at the ground with tears in his tiny black eyes, and finally the captain, who couldn't run because of a shattered leg. What have you done? Jason asked in hysterical tones. We've stopped a tyrant that was holding your town in an iron grip of fear and slavery, Seltemver said, as he walked over and helped the man up, wincing at the sound of grating bone and the man's whimpers of pain. But the captain was at a loss for words. Belt up, Captain, or should I say, Lord? Seltemver smiled despite his own injuries. Let's go to my ship. I have a healer there that can help you. Seltemver turned to Eminar and Filden. Come on, you two. We can rest on the sea haven. He saw the reluctant, fear-filled eyes of Filden and knew that she had changed her mind about going with him. Seltemver, she began, then stopped as Eminar fluttered off and landed upon Seltemver's shoulder once more. The elf raised his hand to stall her. Filden, I'm sure that is the new lord of... He shook his head and laughed, looking askance at the new lord. You really need a new name for this town, by the way. Freeport, Jason said through the pain of his crushed leg. That was what it was called before Massenel came here with his warriors years ago. Good. So, Filden, I'm sure that the Lord of Freeport will let you live now that slavery is going to be abolished. Right, Lord? Seltemver said this last part with an edge to his voice, implying that if it wasn't, there could be more trouble. Of course. Jason turned to Filden, who took him from Seltemver and smiled as best he could as they hobbled to the docks. I'm fine. No one bothered to comfort me or anything, Eminar said, sullenly as he sat on Seltemver's shoulder, sulking. As the group made their way to the docks, Filden and Jason could not contain their surprise at the sight of Seltemver's crew as they looked upon the Sea Haven docked below. Seltemver seemed to be the only elf. Orcs worked busily at rigging supplies and other tasks as one larger orc stood near the wheel shouting orders. Don't be alarmed. The orcs of the Sea Haven have no problem with humans, but they knew how they would have been greeted, so they stayed on the ship when it docked, Seltemver said, laughing at their faces. Eminar went flying ahead, waving at the orcs, but seemed to be invisible to them as they ignored him and his gestures. One orc, a gray-skinned female with braids, came down the plank as they neared, shaking her head. We heard Aminar's voice, just couldn't resist causing trouble, could you, Seltemver? Shut it, Grunhild, Seltemver said, laughing. He turned to Jason and Filden as the orc approached. Lord, lady, this is Grunhild, my healer. Is that an amulet of Dava? Jason asked incredulously. Yes, do you have a problem with the god of protection and life? Grunhild asked, her tusks showing through her wide smile. No, just... Seltemver patted Jason on the shoulder lightly. I know. You didn't think Dava would have an orc for a follower. Well, he does, and she channels his power with skilled hands and a full heart. He caught Filden staring at the orc's healer's figure and laughed again. Grunhild may be an orc, but she was in fine shape for a female of her kind. Let's get aboard and tend to your wounds. We have some things we want to ask the new Lord of Freeport, and some wine that is itching to be had. Epilogue. Setting sail. Brunhild had the Norlord's legs splinted in record time, her healing hands working miracles on the wounded man and making it easier for the breaks to heal. Bones would take a while to fully heal, but her power made it easier for the body to do that. The cuts and bruises were gone in minutes, though, much to the Lord's shock. Filden helped Jason with his recovery as the orcs repaired the ship, but Seltemver knew that it would turn into something a lot more than that. He was good at reading people, after all. The new Lord had some questions about the damage done to the ship, as most of it did not look to be storm-related. Cannon fire had wrecked most of it, and the mast was charred from fire. Seltemver explained it away as an attack before the storm. Again, at least half of it was true. 10 days later, the Sea Haven eased out of Freeport, its damage repaired and the crew in good spirits. Filden stayed behind in Freeport as expected, holding onto the Lord's arm as they waved goodbye. Now the Sea Haven was sailing on foreign seas with the charts that Lord Jason had provided. They would try for the shore of some place to the west called Handonen. Captain, storm on the horizon, the lookout, a smaller orc named Crack, called out. Seltemver frowned as a sea breeze blew his short white hair. He was afraid of this. He knew they were cursed, always getting caught in this strange storm and being sent someplace else. Just the time it took to show up was different. Well, Eminar, where do you think we'll end up next? Eminar never answered the rhetorical question. No one could know. Great. Here we go again, was the only thing the imp ever said. The end, and thank you for listening.